joining us again as we travel through the Gospel of Mark, again trying to figure out what it means to be covered in the dust of our rabbi. Our goal is to get as close as we can in this earliest Gospel to the stories around Jesus and who he was and what he was like, so that we can figure out more and more what it means to be his followers. So Mark 8, we see what to many of us might seem to be like a miracle on repeat. It starts in John chapter 8, with Jesus feeding 4,000, and to a large degree it's like, didn't we just do Jesus feeding the 5,000? Well, yes, we did. I would actually encourage you to take a few moments and read verses 1 through 13, which is where the miracle is recorded, and compare and contrast what we read earlier, just a little bit earlier, where Jesus feeds the 5,000, and understand why it is that Mark might have included those miracles almost back to back. What's ironic about this miracle is that in verse 14, immediately after this, the disciples had, verse 11 is what I meant to say, verse 11. The Pharisees came and began to question Jesus, to test him. They asked him for a sign from heaven. Hello, sign from... Did they not see what just happened with bread and fish being multiplied and baskets of food left over? So, I can just imagine the conversation. Well, Jesus, we need a sign. If we're going to believe you, we need a sign. And Jesus is like, well, I just fed 4,000 people with just a few loaves. No, we need a different sign. Oh, you need a different sign then? A better sign? Like a more powerful one? Maybe do something with like, lamb and not fish? Do you need me to levitate? The irony of this is the fact that they were not willing to see. And so it almost didn't matter what Jesus did, they weren't going to see. And it harkens back to an earlier chapter where Jesus went to his hometown, and it says because of the lack of faith, he could do no miracles. So there's very much a powerful spiritual truth here, which is our willingness to see is actually going to impact what we see. Our willingness to embrace by faith the message and the words of Jesus is going to very much impact what we experience by faith. So what we bring dictates what we get. And there's something very powerful for us there and now. Jesus then in verse 14 challenges the disciples around the leaven or the teaching of the Pharisees and the Sadducees, because they're in the boat and they've only got one loaf of bread. And can you imagine Jesus in conversation with the disciples? They're going like, oh, got one loaf, and Jesus says, I'll look out for the leaven and the yeast of the Pharisees and the Sadducees. And they're like going, he's saying this because we've got one loaf. And Jesus is like, oh my goodness, I'm so surrounded by people who aren't getting this. He says, when I broke the 5 loaves for the 5,000, how many baskets of pieces did you pick up? And they said, 12. And when I broke the 7 loaves for the 4,000, how many basketfuls did you pick up? Well, 7. And then could you imagine Jesus then locking eyes with them and saying, do you still not understand? I'm like, if I'm one of the disciples, I'm going, no, yes, no. There's no hiding from the gaze of Jesus when he's in the boat and he's asking you a direct question. The disciples were not getting it. And this leads to the miracle. The miracle in verses 22 through 26 is really a one-of-a-kind miracle where Jesus heals a blind man at Bethsaida. But it's a 2-stage miracle. The first stage of the miracle is where Jesus takes the blind man by the hand, leads him outside the village, spits on the man's eyes, puts his hands on him, and then says, what do you see? And the man says this really intriguing comment. He says, I see people, they look like trees walking around. So it's like he's halfway there. Once more, Jesus put his hands on the man's eyes, and then his eyes were open, and his sight was restored, and he saw everything clearly. No other place do we see a 2-part miracle like this. It's almost like some of us are going to think, well, Jesus was like, I only use 50% of my power, because I give you 50% of a miracle. But there's actually a point to this. There's 3 stages of sight here that the miracle points to. Remember, miracles or signs point to a deeper spiritual reality or truth that the gospel writer is trying to allude to through the person of Jesus. So we've got blindness, we've got semi-sight, and then we've got clear sight. So who does blindness pertain to? Who is the blind ones? Well, that's obviously the Pharisees and the Sadducees, completely blind. It's like, show us a sign. Well, you didn't see the 4,000, blind. And then we've got the one who sees 50%. These are the disciples on the boat going, Jesus, can you? And these are the ones who see people like trees walking around. But then there's a third stage of sight, which is like seeing clearly. And Mark is pointing us to a time where we will see clearly what Jesus is about, even though the Pharisees are blind and the disciples are half blind. Then there's this powerful transaction where Jesus asks what appears to be an innocent question, and then quickly it becomes very not innocent. So he talks to the guys, and verse 27 says, who do people, those people out there, who do they say that I am? And they're going, some say Elijah, and some say John the Baptist, and blah, blah, blah. And they give these safe answers because it's a safe question. Who do people out there say that I am? And then Jesus makes it completely unsafe, and he looks at them and says, who do you say that I am? And now it's like, me. And Peter has this revelation where he says, you're the Messiah. You're the Son of the living God. But to reflect the half-blindness that the disciples still carry, we move into the next section of the chapter where Jesus now says, now that you've used those words that I'm Messiah, I will tell you what kind of Messiah I'm going to be. He began to teach them in verse 31 that the Son of Man must suffer many things and be rejected by the elders, the chief priests and the teachers of the law, and that he must be killed and after 3 days rise again. Well, then Peter rebukes him and says, no. If you're going to be my Messiah, let me tell you how this has to work. And then Jesus rebukes him and says, get behind me, Satan. And his words are, you do not have in mind the concerns of God, but merely human concerns. So here's Peter again exercising his half sight, half blindness. He says something that's true, that Jesus is the Messiah, but what he doesn't have a clue about is what kind of Messiah Jesus is. And Jesus at this point unwraps the kernel of what his Messiahship will really be about, and it will be about death and suffering. Now think about this. Up till this point, what Mark has been doing is been saying Jesus is the boss of demons. And then Jesus is the boss who got authority over illness. Jesus is the boss who got authority over nature. Jesus is the boss, or he's got authority over the temple code and the religious law. And Jesus has even got authority over death. And it's like bigger. So Peter is just following the trajectory here. And he's going like, well, you're the Messiah. So we're going bigger. Boss! You're the boss. It's like you're going to dominate everybody. You're going to do this miracle thing, and the Romans are going to disappear, and all the temple people are going to get it, and we're going to create the people of God around you and your message, Jesus. But all of a sudden, instead of bigger boss, Jesus says, now that you've used that word Messiah, let me tell you what kind of Messiah I will be. The way that I'm going to unwrap the knot at the heart of the human story is by my suffering and by my death. And of course, this is what Peter can't handle. And so he takes Jesus aside, as any good follower of Jesus would do, and rebukes him. But in some ways, this is just like us, because what we do is we desire the bigger thing. We desire to create change through creating Christian celebrities and celebrity pastors. Or we would rather bring change. We believe change will come by holding more massive worship services with a cooler song. Or we think we would rather bring change and see the knot at the heart of the human story unraveled by being good moral people. And so we've got our own narrative in terms of how we think change should happen. But Jesus says, no, it's not going to be happening. See, the safe conversation we engage in is what should churches be doing? Well, how then should Christians live? What should a good Christian do in order to respond to such and such? Well, the Catholic Church, they ought to be doing such and such. Or rich churches, they should do such and such. Or the charismatic renewal movement, they should do such and such. But then Jesus would turn a safe question into a dangerous question and say, yeah, but what about you? How do you think change would happen? And our typical narrative would be go bigger, boss. We just need bigger and more. But what if Jesus sat down and said to us, well, the pathway to true transformation is as we embrace the path of suffering. Because then he says these powerful words at the end of chapter 8. He called the crowd to him along with his disciples and says, whoever wants to be my disciple must deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me. For whoever wants to save their life or dominate, or win, or conquer, they will lose it. But whoever loses their life for me, in other words, follows me to the cross, and for the gospel will save it. And so Jesus says, this is the way that the world will be changed. I, as Messiah, have now revealed to you that the pathway to true transformation is to be revealed through my suffering, and those who are to change the world with me will also do it by following me on that same pathway of suffering. Now, this is a hard message for us to hear. None of us likes to suffer. Suffering is not really entered into willingly or in a happy or joyous way for us. It's something that will come, and it's something that found Jesus. Jesus didn't actually create his own suffering. It was because of the agendas and the abandonment of the people around him. But it certainly was the will of his Father to suffer. And I think you and I, if we're going to be part of the change that this world needs, will need to, at some point or another, adopt a posture of being willing to accept suffering. We'd rather have the bigger boss narrative, just like Peter, but I wonder if Jesus would not be rebuking that narrative and say, no, it's going to look a lot different than that. So Mark is going to tell us a little bit more about that later. This is a powerful truth that gives us some keys about how things change and about how we change. So look, God bless you. I trust that this troubles you a little bit, actually, as this chapter troubles me, because Mark has just dropped a bomb in the middle of this narrative, and it's just completely changed the direction of this. So look, God bless. We'll see you next week when we look at chapter 9.